Marlene, you must have been out in that air.
Girl, it's something out there. It's got me all messed up.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it isn't what I had.
Alderwoman Davis, one moment, please.
Okay. Oh, God.
You can begin your meeting, Alderwoman Davis.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. What I'd like to do is get our meeting started. I think we'll have a short meeting today and a longer meeting tomorrow. So let's just get started. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Alderman Boyd. Alderman Vaquero.
Present.
Alderwoman Howard.
Present.
Alderwoman Spencer.
Present.
Thank you. Alderwoman Boyd.
Present.
Alderman Muhammad. Alderman Oldenburg. Alderwoman Navarro.
Present.
Alderwoman Middlebrook.
Present.
Alderwoman Evans. Chairwoman Davis.
Present. Wait a minute, I got it. Yeah, present.
Reed. 7 present, you have quorum.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask for a motion to pass the minutes, please.
I'll make a motion.
So moved.
Yeah, seconded.
It's been moved and seconded to approve our minutes in our last meeting. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Alderman Boyd.
Aye.
Alderman Vaquero.
Aye.
Alderwoman Howard.
Aye.
Alderwoman Spencer.
Aye.
Alderwoman Boyd.
Aye.
Alderman Muhammad. Alderman Oldenburg. Alderwoman Navarro.
Aye.
Alderwoman Middlebrook.
Aye.
Alderwoman Evans. Chairwoman Davis.
Aye.
8 aye votes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our board bill number 1 for review today, we did not get to our budget director because I know that he had some things and he has sent us the supplemental budget that he had an opportunity to work on for a moment. And you do know that even since that point, there are some other things that have been discussed. And what we want to do is to hear from the budget director today, and then we'll go from there. So, Mr. Director, if you'd like to, can you please move forward with explaining that supplemental budget document that you have prepared, and also any other items that you wanted to share with us, please?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and members of the committee. Yeah, in terms of supplemental budget, I don't have a supplemental budget.
I'm saying the wrong term.
Okay. Just information, just discussing where we are on.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
There you go.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, well, we're sort of at a strange place in the budget. Typically, what would have occurred at this point in time would have been, would have been some reductions as you would have approved in your committee and requested additions, and that would have gone back to E&A. That would have been considered, and then E&A would respond, and you'd be sort of adopting all or a portion of whatever came back from the Board of E&A. Now that has not transpired. And just to refresh your memory, there was an issue, obviously, since the budget was submitted, that there was revenue estimated from the federal housing of prisoners that was included in the budget that has since been identified as not being available in FY22. So there was a need to correct that. Now, typically, again, the process would have been cuts and adds. But looking at the calendar, as we all know, we have to have a budget by July 1st. That was going to be difficult. So as we contemplate that, I was thinking, well, a subsequent position would be that you could reduce a line item and then fix that in an amendment later. But again, that would require at least adoption of Board Bill 1 through the normal course by July 1st. If I could, I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to share the screen here. Do you see the document in front of you with the special
Yes, sir.
fund? Okay, well, let me walk you through what I'm talking about here. This is that special fund, 1116, the corrections special fund.
Is it possible to make it a little bit larger on the screen?
Let's see.
Maybe up there where there you go. That's better.
Is it? Okay. Okay, great. All right. So this is just a history of that special fund, and I wanted to point out what the issues were with it. So at the end of last fiscal year, there was actually a balance. And the end of FY20, it was a balance of $3.6 million. And we are currently projecting about $5.2 million. And this is the 70% of the revenues that come in. So we were getting a little over $7 million from that source. So this would have been the 70% of that at 5.2. Based on all of that, with certain expenditures, personnel services, they had a transport unit in there. But the big cost here was the medical services for those housed in the Justice Center. And so that was included there. And there were some expenses related to facility improvements and all, and there's encumbrances there. Would have been leaving about a $2 million balance at the end of this current fiscal year, which would carry over. Now, the big change here on the revenue side in FY22 is that this was going to be 4.7 million. So it ended up being, and again, it ends up being about 66,000 or some residual amount that we're expecting in July. It could be a little higher or lower. But what that does is that if you follow the numbers on the revenue side and the budget is $5.8 million. That puts this budget at $5.8 million in the hole. But you did have that beginning balance, so 3.8 million in this fund. Now that's the 70% of the budget. Now you did have the other 30%, which was general fund. That's $2 million. Now I'm going to ignore the general fund for a moment because it has fund balances, so that would not be sufficient to make it a deficit. So, but the question then would be, all right, so without the cut and adds option that would be typically pursued, theoretically, you could have say, okay, well, let's reduce, reduce this line item by about $3.8 million, such that it would balance at the end of the fiscal, be projected to balance at the fiscal year, and then amend the budget later because you know you're going to need to do that. Well, if that's not an option, the other final resort, and what we may be pursuing at this point in discussions with the comptroller is, well, how do you avoid this negative outcome? Well, what we could do is this contractual service line item here in the current fiscal year, there are two, it's that medical services costs are charged at two places. One is the general fund and one is the special fund. So you'll see in the budget, you're going to see a budget for medical in the current fiscal year on both costs. If we can find sufficient room within the total appropriation in the current fiscal year under the general fund, in other words, $3.8 million. Most departments, we've been generally tracking under budget. So the question is, can you find a sufficient room within the current fiscal year so that some of these current year charges can be charged over the general fund versus this fund to the tune of about $3.8 million? That would be sufficient to reduce or increase this ending balance such that next year's fund, by the end of next year, it does not go negative. And so that would be the sort of the final resort option, failing any other amendment to Board Bill 1. how do we avoid this particular fund going deficit? And I think that's what we're looking at currently. Obviously, any other opportunity you have for amendments would be dependent on getting Board Bill 1 passed by July 1st. But if that's not the case, then this would be that sort of last resort option. Bit unorthodox, but it would get us to that end result.
Okay. Wow. So, did you have anything else that you wanted to explain, sir?
No, that's all I have.
Okay, and I do believe that requires some questions from the committee, so I'm hoping that they understand it better than I did. So, Alderman Boyd.
I think I missed something, so I'm gonna just wait and come. You can come back to me.
Okie
If I have-
dokie. Alderman Vaccaro.
Yeah, I mean, so Paul, what it seems to me like, where you're suggesting we take something out, the contractual services, even knowing we're really gonna put them back.
Hey, put this on the table.
Or,
Alderwoman Boyd, could you mute yourself?
I mean,
I'm sorry.
to me, that doesn't seem appropriate to take something out that we're saying, well, we're gonna have to put it back. But so we can show a balanced budget, we're gonna take this number away, even though we know we're gonna put it back. We're really not taking it away. We're taking it away for the purpose of balancing a budget, knowing that we're gonna put it back.
Well, that's not what you're, in that instance, what you're just trying to do is trying to ensure that your appropriation is not exceeding your revenue estimates. And that was just a technical solution. But that's what I'm discussing here is something that would not entail an amendment. Basically, what it's doing is saying, of this $5.9 million that we've spent through June 14th on this report, if sufficient room within the general fund in total appropriations can be found to accept $3.8 million of these expenses, then the current fiscal year would end with a significant amount of a balance such that this $3.8 million negative balance would be eradicated. Again, it's sort of an unorthodox way of doing it, but the whole intent is to end up with a budget for this fund that is not deficit. And that's lacking any other option. That would be what we would be pursuing if Board Bill 1 isn't amended in due course by the end of the fiscal year.
It's so unorthodox. I mean, the way I see it, it's more of a sham. I mean, it's like, we could actually say, well, let's just eliminate it. We'll go down to the casino. We could put all the money on a number, and if it comes up, we'll be in good shape.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what I
mean, just see, I know I'm being whatever, but it's not a balanced budget, and of course
it would be. It would be. Well, let me explain. Is that basically what the question was? There's two different questions. One is are you meeting your technical definition of balance, which is you do not want both the available revenues as well as any deficit or balance in that fund to go negative. All right. So right now, unless we do something, unless Board Bill 1 is amended or some other action is taken, this fund is negative, projected, right? So what steps can we take to avoid that outcome? Well, one, you would have done the cuts and adds, and we could have fixed that in the normal process, right? Well, that seems to be based on the timetable a bit remote. So two, we could just reduce this line item by a certain amount $3.8 million specifically, and that would have balanced this fund. Of course, then you'd say, hey, we don't have enough for medical going forward, right? So finally, lacking any of those two other options, the one is, well, how do you fix this outcome? Well, if, and again, I think this is the likely possibility, is that we reduce the amount that has been charged against this fund in the current fiscal year with sufficient appropriations that remain at the end of the fiscal year in the general fund. So the general fund line item that's being charged goes up, this one goes down, such that this goes from $2 million balance to a $5.8 million balance, which is enough to offset this deficit projection in FY22. Not the ideal solution, but it gets you to the point where you end up with this fund not going deficit, which is what you're trying to accomplish. And again, without any amendment to Board Bill 1, that would be the only option I could come up with to achieve that.
I guess in the services are the medical services, and you know, taking the medical services out, I don't know. It just seems. I guess I'm not comfortable with that. Let me just say I'm just not comfortable. I mean, I know you've explained it. It seems to me like just a numbers thing. We're going to move numbers in a circle and then hope for the best. But it would have been, and I don't know, it would have been much nicer to have had this sent over in the first place properly. And the cuts and putbacks, there's no way we would have found $6 million in cuts and putbacks. We're lucky on a good day if we can find a couple $100,000, you know. So I mean to say, gee, ideally it would have been in cuts and putbacks. I've never seen in the 12 years I've been here, I've never seen us get more than a couple $100,000 to find $6 million in cuts and putbacks. I mean, anyway, Paul, I'm gonna let it go, but I don't think just moving numbers in a circle is appropriate. I think it's a sham. You know, I think, you know.
Well, I again, all the expenses would continue to be paid. It's about where they're being paid from. So again, I agree with you, and to the extent that is not typically the way budget process goes. But when you're presented with a set of circumstances, you say, okay, this is the ideal solution. This is the next solution, and then what can we do to get to where we need to be? And that's what I'm being proposed. So
I'm also, you know, the other thing, you know, and we'll keep going back to the jail. Of course, obviously, you know, I'm not for closing the workhouse, and apparently it's not closed. We're just going to rename it the Annex Building. But there were no funds even available to do that. So that's going to create even a bigger deficit, because now we're keeping it open, which I'm all for keeping it open. You know, that whole thing arose by any other name, but so we won't call it the workhouse, we'll call it an annex. But now there has to be funding available to keep that open. That's nowhere in this budget.
let me address that one as well. Let's see. Pull it up.
I think it was Shakespeare, wasn't it? Arose by any other name? Could be wrong about that.
Let's talk about the corrections budget for a second. Okay.
Yeah, this is the budget I wanted you to explain.
Okay. Well, this is where I want to go over, because I think it's important to understand where we are in the budget regarding. Because I actually saw some of that public safety testimony saying, okay, there was not a 632, but I think whether there's a 632 or a 633 is sort of irrelevant when you talk about the numbers themselves. All right. So here was the budget again, and this was the same slide I used earlier when we discussed all of this. On FY21, here's the budget. We had 600. MSI's budget was $7.8 million, and the Justice Center's budget was 21.556. Okay. Then we had that special fund, which is the special fund I was just focusing on. That's $5.6 million. So the total budget was 34.9, almost $35 million from those three budgets, right? So you fast forward, and here we are in FY22's proposed budget. 632 was zeroed out. And you got 633 at $27.8 million. And then you have the special fund at $5.9 million. That was about a $33.9 million total, which is a decline of $1.1 million. All right. So while I know there's been a lot of discussions about the 7.8, hey, there's 7.8 cut out. There was not 7.8 cut out of this budget. And the MSI cost center was down, but most of those costs were shifted over to the 633. And by the way, if you look at the budget, the actual document, it doesn't say 633 Justice Center, it just says 633 Corrections. And that was intentional. That was to say, look, the budget isn't determining when MSI would open or close. That's more of an executive decision. All it's saying is this is how much money that is being budgeted for corrections in FY22. And that's all that's doing, okay? So now, again, so the difference of the 1.1. Now, remember, I had mentioned earlier that, well, part of that, the reason why it's not a little higher is because you've got the health and pension costs that went up this year. And so there were some costs that would have been lower otherwise. It's about $1 million. But then we also had Circuit Court, which had $360,000 in their budget for electronic monitoring program. So overall, taking those two, you probably had about a net decline of about $1.7 million, which is what, not coincidentally, was the funding source for the new initiatives with the Civilian Oversight Board, the PDA, as well as the Supportive Reentry Program, which is $1.3 million. So that's how that primarily was funded. So, and then again, on the personnel totals, you said, how many positions were there? Well, there's 128 vacant positions. 93 of those were removed. So anyone who's currently working for the city for corrections, whether you're at MSI or whether it was at MSI or the Justice Center, is also budgeted in FY22. It's just that the number of vacancies have been reduced. So you still have those individuals there. Now, the issue which I was just describing was on the revenue side. You can see what the original estimates were about $10 million in $10.7 million in prisoner reimbursements. That had been declined a little bit. I had it down to 6.7. Oh, I think it's going to be closer to 7 in this fiscal year of 8.8 million, but 6.7 of that was federal, right? Well, now.
Paul, I don't mean to interrupt, but doesn't that amount include the $9 million we would have been getting from the federal that's not there?
Well,
you're telling me the budget that's still,
yeah, that was my point.
Dollars.
Yeah, that was my point. This 6.7 million is going away.
Right.
So that was what created the challenge. Okay, that's what this is. The 2 million of that was general fund. 4.7 of that was going to be that special fund. So that's the challenge that I was trying to discuss on that other screen, where I said, well, how do we make that up so that we don't go deficit in that special fund? But this addresses basically your second question about, well, there's no budget for MSI at all. What is the issue? So what I say to that is all corrections funds are now under 633. And if there are individuals that need to work back and forth between 632 or the 632 doesn't no longer exist, but let's say that facility, then you'd still have the same individuals who are doing that. Now, would it require maybe some transfers within accounts? That could be, but collectively, the funding levels is comparable to the current fiscal year. So that shouldn't be the issue. I think the bigger issue is the revenue side, where you basically identified that we're going to not have this revenue next year.
Well, but isn't there going to be, since we put 160 people in Kentucky?
Well, yeah, but that's a different, yeah, no, I agree. And that's a different issue. Right. That's not,
Isn't there some cost with that associated, and then the cost with transporting them back and forth?
well, that's my understanding is that's the feds doing.
Those are not our prisoners.
Yeah, that's right. That's not us doing that. That's the feds. When they basically pulled their people out, they are relocating them to other locations.
Well, some of those have state charges, and so
But they were
with St. Louis for trial.
No, I understand, but they were within, those are the ones that were within federal custody, and the feds were moving them out to other locations. So that would not be our, well, the city's transport or cost.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm sure there's other people who have questions, but I mean, obviously for keeping the other place open, which I think we should, there's costs involved that don't show up in this. And I know what you're saying, but the number still includes not the $9 million that we're not getting, you know, in this budget, in the screen that you're showing.
Well, actually,
$9 million.
Let me, the 2 million is from the state. That's still in there. Okay. I broke these out into two. You can see the difference. The state per diem, which by the way, at $22.58 per day, doesn't even come close to what our costs are. That's just the state. That's about $2.2 million. It's the Fed portion, which was the $90 a day. That's the at this estimate was 6.7. That's the piece that's going away.
Right, but that's included in the top part on the 27. So that 27 is really more like 21.
I'm not. You lose me.
So you're showing the 1010 fund having 27,900,000.
Yes, that's the budget.
Okay,
that's
now,
budget.
But that's including the 6 million. You know, even if you say okay, the 2 million still there, but
no, that includes. Remember, this is Fund 1010, so general fund is including $2 million of that revenue.
But it's including also the 6 million, isn't it?
Well, no, the general fund includes 2, and the special fund includes 4.7. All right, just like that other sheet I was showing. So the question was saying, okay, in an ideal world, you'd have the cuts and adds to address those. But if it gets to the point where you don't have sufficient time to address it, how the general fund is not going to be is not going to go deficit because you have the wherewithal within the general fund, particularly in the reserves and such. But the special fund would go into the hole, right? Because it can't sustain that kind of loss. So that's where I was talking about. If you move those charges over, you could create a balance within that special fund such that it would not go deficit at the end of next fiscal year. And that would be sort of the last resort. Should there not be any changes to Board Bill 1, that would be how that would be addressed. And that's.
I mean, I get what you're saying. You're going to basically take the money out of general fund, which would never, I mean, there's reserves, but it still seems like kind of a sham. Because by closing, by closing the workhouse, let me just say, by closing the workhouse, we were told that we're going to save millions and millions and millions of dollars, at least $7 or $8 million. And it doesn't seem like not only we're not saving anything, we're just going to move money in a circle to make it look like, you know, and Paul, I mean, again, I'm one that feels that it was very wrong to close it and move people away and do all these things. I'm just going to mute myself and let other people talk, but we're, you know, the point I guess I'm getting at, not only are we not saving anything, we're just going to use the general fund, which to balance the $6 million out, and we only really have 40 million, I believe is the number in reserves or around that amount. You know, I think, I don't know, anyway, I'm just going to mute myself and listen to everybody. But thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Paul.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. Alderwoman Howard.
Yes, Paul, can I ask you to go back to the previous document?
Okay, let's see if I can do that without. Let's see, still got it up here. Is that up? You see that?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
Okay.
Now, by closing the workhouse, we created a almost $6 million gap in our revenue gap in our budget
Well,
because, or no, by getting rid of the federal detainees.
the federal detainees pulling out, that's what created the loss in the revenue, right? Now,
So
in total, that's about it's close to $7 million loss in revenue. The reason why it's a little less in this illustration is because we did have a beginning balance in this fund that offsets some of that loss. But yeah, the total loss in revenue is more like about 7. So, but yeah, from a budget standpoint, it was about 5.7, 5.8.
So we've created an ongoing deficit for our budget that will be a legacy deficit, correct?
That's actually a good point, because one of the things you want to consider when we talk about structural balance is there's a difference between one-time gaps versus recurring. And you always hate to lose recurring revenue. So that is a loss, yes.
And that will continue because we are no longer accepting those prisoners that were citizens of St. Louis and prosecuted and okay.
That's correct.
So how are, I understand we're getting, going to get some Santa Claus money here from the federal government, but this is not an ongoing issue.
No.
And I just, we do kick the can down the road. And I was happy before the pandemic that we were finally arriving at a place where we had a little bit of money in the bank to cover shortfalls. How much did we, when we had last year, was it last year or the year before? 2020 is a blur. So I guess the 1920 budget gave us a little bit of a breathing room. Is that correct, Paul?
We had a nice surplus in FY19. That was
okay.
Zero surplus. And then last year was sort of closer to break even. Actually, we did a little better than we anticipated. Obviously, COVID hit, and we took the steps necessary to deal with it, and we ended up breaking it. But yeah, we've made some significant strides on our reserves. Yes.
So how much have we delved into what that our I can't remember the word you used, to our money that we had extra that we were putting aside in 19? Have we exhausted that?
No, that's still there. I mean, we were about 52.7, I believe, at the end of the last, on a cash basis at the end of last fiscal year, which is a little over 10% of the budget, which is good. Now, having said that, GFOA's recommendation is something like 2 months worth of expenditures, which would be, 16% or so of budget. So it's something you want to strive toward.
Right. And so what do we have now on here?
Yeah, well, at the end, it'll be measured at the end of the fiscal year. Now, to address this, I don't, in the short term, I don't think it's going to be an issue, because I think revenues right now are outpacing our estimates. So I think you'll have a surplus at the end of the current fiscal year, and which is a good thing. And I think we can continue to work toward, and we have a policy. If you do have a surplus at the end of the fiscal year, half of that goes to capital, which is a one-time benefit, one-time use. And then the other half would just go to the fund balance. So there's a process for handling that, and I think that's a good policy to maintain. But I think what you hit on is that's one time. So on the short term, I don't think that's much of a concern. I think it's more of the longer term. You want to come out once everything else is spent and all this assistance is gone. You want to come out the other end with a structural balance, so that you're not obligated beyond what you have on a recurring basis. And obviously, anytime you lose a recurring source of revenue, that creates that a little bit more of a hole to dig out of.
So, and then I have a problem with using this money that we're getting from the federal government to make up a gap that we created. There's been enough gaps created by the pandemic, and people are out there suffering. And so we intentionally create this gap that's a legacy for, gosh knows, at least for this administration. And I have a problem with that. And so we're just basically going to move money from one place to the other to kind of take this up until we can figure out where we are.
Well, in the current fiscal year, given that you typically don't spend your entire budget, that portion, that 3.8 that I was mentioning, you're hoping to charge it over. That would basically, if it weren't spent, you'd end up being contributing. It raised your end of year surplus. So by using that, you're basically using funds that have been appropriated but not spent.
And these are monies that are contractual monies that pay for prisoners' medical services.
Right.
What else comes out of that?
That's it. I think that is the major line item. And
So
again,
how do we, if we exhaust what will remain in there, which would leave us about $3 million, almost $4 million short on that budget, how do they appropriate that money? Is that, will we have prisoners waiting for medical care because we can't appropriate the money?
No. Let me explain again. So this 5.954, this is what's been spent in the current fiscal year. If you move $3.8 million of that to this current fiscal year within total appropriation, all budgets, all departments, you're going to be underspending the budget. You move those charges over to the general fund. Then that number gets reduced by 3.8 million. So this end of year balance becomes 5.8 million. Well, if that's 5.8 million, this becomes zero. So basically it's a way of making sure that this appropriation, which is in the budget, has sufficient resources to cover that budget. But that only helps you in FY22. After that, this fund is basically gone, right?
Yeah.
So it's not more the short term, it's the longer term issue, because you will no longer have this fund to work with once FY22 is over.
I'm sorry, my dog's barking, but hold on a minute. So we are creating a legacy deficit, and I just find that a misrepresentation and morally wrong for the future. And I don't fault you, Paul. I know this is your operating. What you're doing here is what needs to be done, and I'm sure it's legitimate and everything. But I just think that it's not a good way to manage our budget. So it morally to me seems a little bit, not even a little bit. It's disingenuous. So, and that's all I have to say. I just can't, go along with this. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Alderwoman. Alderwoman Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Payne, for being here today. I know we've gone through this several times, and I hate to say this, I still don't fully understand if we've created, if there's now, if there's now a budget hole of several $1 million, how, I don't understand from a broad, we've got the $500 million general budget, and then there's this whole, it seems like we're playing musical chairs with money. If we're sort of, I just don't fully understand how we address that hole. Before you explain it again, because I still don't understand it, we're looking at this slide that you presented. If you go back to the other slide related to the corrections, this one. We have Fund 1010, or excuse me, the MSI and the Justice Center is in two funds. Can you help me understand why that Fund 1116 exists? Why is that separated out to begin with?
Because there was an ordinance passed when, first of all, the Department of Corrections entered into this agreement with the feds to house federal prisoners. And so they were starting.
And Paul, when was that?
The first the first amount we see, FY19, I believe. So, because there wasn't any history prior to that. So it's only been a couple fiscal years. Okay.
Okay.
So we started receiving those revenues, but corrections wanted to have a special fund created for their own use of those funds, right? Rather than, because typically you enter an agreement, you get paid, and then it end up going to general revenue. So they said, oh, well, we want to make some improvements. We want to do things for corrections specifically. And so an ordinance was passed so that 70% of those funds would go into this special fund and 30% would go into the general revenue. So that's why you have that special, fund.
And Paul, who oversees the expenditures of that special fund?
Well, it's the departmental, it is part of the corrections budget. It's just like any other special fund budget under that department.
Okay. Moving forward, does that fund need to exist?
Well, in the current fiscal year, were I doing the budget today without any revenue, you would probably not have it. But given that it's already existed in this budget, the question was, well, how do you close it out? Because if you don't have any revenue coming in from that source, then under the ordinance, you're not going to have anything. You're not going to have any resources to budget under. So what I was explaining is that, all right, you've got all other things being equal, you had a $2 million balance projected in that fund, but you've got a budget of 5.8. So by creating in the current fiscal year, moving charges to general revenue, creating a balance of 5.8 to cover the projected balance, the projected budget, you basically are zeroing out that fund in FY22. And there would be if there's no revenue, there's no purpose in budgeting it going forward after that.
So then will that fold into the City Justice Center Fund 1010?
Well, it wouldn't exist. I mean, the sole source of revenue to this fund is the 70% of federal.
Right. Well, I understand that, but that's precisely why I don't understand why the contractual and other services are coming out of that fund, right? In this budget, and then moving forward, will those contractual services, the medical, the food, et cetera.
Right. Well, it's just the medical.
Excuse me, medical. Okay. Will the medical be then out of the
general fund?
Yeah.
Correct.
Will it come out of the 1010 for the Justice Center?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, correct.
So,
yes.
Okay. So the 1010 for the MSI being zeroed out. This is a little bit confusing to me because for several reasons. One, it was announced that despite some terminology of closing the workhouse, it's going to remain open. The back portion of it is to house overflow, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Well, how can we have a building operational with no budget?
Again, what I yeah, here, let me explain. 633 is corrections. There is no budget for, if you look at Board Bill 1, if you look at the line on budget, it's just 633 and it says corrections. And that was when I proposed the budget this year, even before the discussion of whether or not whether it was going to be opened or closed, I was thinking, well, that's a possibility. So if that's the case, combine the two cost centers. Regardless of whether or not you open it or close it, combine the two cost centers. So what does that budget look like? Here's total corrections. Whether it's 631 or 632 or 633, it's one budget for corrections. What does that look like? So you have that, all right? So regardless of whether they're working at this location or that location, it's one budget. So that's how you think about it. Then you say, okay, you are closing the facility. What does that do? And when I went through my budget presentation originally, I said, okay, here's what it was before, and here was the changes. And those changes resulted in about $1.8 million or so reduction net. And then as a result of those changes, that net changed, we added some new initiatives. But if you think of it as one Department of Corrections, regardless of you're a correctional officer, whether you work at the CJC or whether you're pulled out and working at the workhouse location or the MSI location, it's just corrections. And that's how that's been presented in the budget.
So the funds are not limited to the CJC. So when you're looking at fiscal year 2022,
Correct.
that 633 CJC should really, I think, be labeled corrections.
It actually, in this presentation is not simply because I was trying to do the illustration,
Sure.
but if you look at the board bill, if you look at the line item budget, it just says corrections. That's all it says.
Okay,
It
good.
does.
Because I do think that that would be very helpful. I understand, getting this done quickly, Paul, because, to me, just for transparency for the public, we're not actually closing the workhouse. We're going to keep it open for overflow. And, if there's going to be funds associated with that, speaking, then we should be transparent about, the fact that that's happening. And the budget, the funds going there. What's confusing to me is the reduction of folks housed in our corrections facilities by the number of federal prisoners, which is significant. That reduction of $6 million of federal funding coming to the city was based on the number of people that were housed on behalf of the feds. At a cost of $86 per person per day, which is far below the cost that it takes for the city to house somebody. How we could eliminate all of those people, their medical needs, their food, the staffing associated with it, the housing costs around those people, and still see and only see a reduction in the cost of housing people by $1 million. It looks like the 7.8 million that we were previously spending on MSI, just sort of most of it, the vast majority of those dollars swooped up into the CJC budget, and the CJC budget went from 21.5 to $28 million. But we are housing a significantly reduced number of people. So what I think would be very helpful in understanding what it is we're actually doing here is taking that CJC, the corrections budget, and breaking it out into how much of it is going into the MSI annex building and how much of it is actually going to the CJC, because the CJC is a standalone functioning building that has a finite cost associated with it, which was probably pretty consistent year over year, my guess. And the MSI building, to break that out, it's a little misleading, or I think in some ways, to kind of roll them all into one when it's essentially the same amount of money minus $1 million.
Well,
does that make sense?
no, yeah, it's sort of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because the idea was that going in, you don't know what this outcome is going to be. So how can you craft a budget to give you that flexibility such that is that facility, MSI facility, going to be open for how long? I would think if you asked anyone, the answer would be they don't know. Mm-hmm. So when they proposed the budget, and I remember saying this when I presented it at the first time, saying the budget will not dictate how long or when that facility has to close or when it would close or anything like that. All the budget's doing is saying this is how much money you have to spend within the fiscal year.
Right, but I think having these different funds is it's kind of hard to parse through, because at the end of the day, fiscal year 2021, we had a total of $35 million in corrections. Fiscal year 2022, we have a total of $34 million in corrections. And we have a significantly reduced number of people that we're housing in fiscal year 2022. How is that possible? Why aren't we seeing a bigger savings, with this greatly reduced number of people And is it because at the end of the day, we truly are keeping MSI open for that overflow? And have we, you know, what is there, I don't see the plan or outline. And what are we going to do with that building? And what is going, you know, I think zeroing out that fund for MSI is misleading. And I know that is not your intention, but it certainly doesn't articulate to the it just doesn't articulate to the general public what it is we're actually doing and why we're not seeing that larger savings we expected.
Well,
And I think, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead and finish. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
Well, and I think part of it is because, you know, to be honest with the public, we, you know, if we're going to keep that open, you know, there is a cost associated with it. And, you know, we have to articulate that to the public that this is going to cost us money, and we can't, you know, the closure of it is in name only and it's not in function, and it's still going to have a major cost associated with it.
Yeah, let me the one I was going to jump on was the savings that are anticipated. Nothing that I produced in the last year anticipated that there would be significant savings from that. I remember specifically a memo I wrote to E&A last fall, which basically said the big cost with corrections is in the personnel. And if you are maintaining all those personnel, unless you start laying off or something like that, you are not going to see significant savings. I mean, from that switch. I mean, maybe over time you would, but basically what you're seeing is what I had expected you're going to be able to see. You're moving the personnel that were over at MSI over to the Justice Center, and that's where you ended up. Now, within this number, just keep in mind, there's an assumption of about a $1.4 million in outstate housing. That was another item that was included in the corrections budget in case they went over what was then available, but that was assuming that MSI would not be available. Now, if MSI is available, I would expect that $1.4 million would be applied more towards MSI's costs as opposed to some being housed somewhere else. So those are the kind of things you got to look at. But yeah, the notion that there would be a significant reduction overall in corrections, I think given that it's mostly personnel, that is not going to, that doesn't happen immediately. And I think this sort of confirms, just by looking at the budgets, what you're looking at.
Okay, so, going back to the original question, I just don't, if we had this 1116 fund that it had $5.9 million worth of services that we had associated with it. We had some million, what was it? I don't remember, some number of million that were left in from previous year. And we're shuffling money from the general fund into this. I mean, I don't fully understand how the $3.8 million materialized.
Okay.
Without subsequently altering the pot from which it came. Sure.
So again, ideally you would go through the normal budget amendment process, and this item, this 5390, which is the budget for the proposed budget for FY22, would have been reduced, and we would have had reductions and through regular amendments, right? And that would have brought this down to a balanced budget on 1116, right? That's the normal process. But if we can't get there from this normal process of amendments, cuts and adds, and that whole process, I'm looking at this and saying, well, how do we get to this balancing act short of getting a series of amendments passed? Well, what are we doing this fiscal year? You currently have a budget that you're about to wind up in FY21, right? On the general fund side. These charges, medical costs, are charged both the general fund and the special fund. It's the same line item. I mean, it's just a portion is paid out of general fund, a portion is paid out of the special fund. As the fiscal year winds down and through the comptroller's office, they always look at, okay, here's our total appropriation somewhat less than $500 million. How are we doing? How much money we got left that has not been spent? Is there enough room within that total appropriation? So for instance, if a department might be going over here at one location and some other department has available appropriation, they have the ability to move those funds to cover that expense, so that all the budget, everything gets paid appropriately, and we're working within, the caveat is that you have to work within that total appropriation for the year, right? You can't go over that. That's a legal limit. So is there room within that legal limit of the current budget to assume sufficient funds to that $3.8 million? Because if you can move $3.8 million of these current year charges to the general fund in the current year's budget, that would be sufficient to create this balance at the end of the current fiscal year such that this number is no longer a deficit for next year, projected. That only, and then after that, this, as I mentioned, this fund goes away and it's no longer a factor. But all of this is trying to do is get over this hump of this one time, well, at least this current budget issue regarding the loss of this revenue.
Oh,
Paul, this is sufficiently complicated.
It is, and it's unfortunate that we're in that, and coming up with having to, you sort of identify what's your ideal solution, and if your ideal solution doesn't work, what's your next solution, and if your next solution doesn't work, and that's sort of what you have to come up with given the set of circumstances we've got.
How is this kind of unprecedented? How often have we had to do something like this where the revenue numbers changed significantly during the budget process?
And that late in the budget process, not. Now, last year was a little unusual because it was COVID and we had to, nobody knew what was going on at that point. And so you had to reassess what your revenue projections were. And I think we fared pretty well given the circumstances. Right. This is a little unusual in that, yeah, you don't usually lose a revenue source this late in the budget process. But given you do have to address it, and you can't sit by and not address it. So failing any amendments, this would be a way of addressing it so that you can finish this budget process.
Okay. I've taken up enough of your time and the committee's time. At this point, I'm going to defer. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to ask questions. Director Payne, thank you so much for all your work on this and making sure that we fit the statutory requirements of having a balanced budget.
thank you. Alderwoman Boyd.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Budget Director Paul Payne. And I guess I keep hearing everybody's confusion because I know I'm confused with this whole robbing Peter to pay Paul syndrome. And so at the end of the day, this is what's going on is what I asked the coastal workhouse people when they talked about closing the workhouse. And my question was, so what are you going to, how, we can't just turn the lock and say the building is closed and we don't have any money. It's still gonna have to be money allocated to be spent at that facility. And now we're hearing about the pods that'll be open. So my question, Paul, do we have a budget and what it would cost to maintain that building?
Okay, let me, again, I'll go back to what we've got in the corrections budget. You currently have within the proposed budget, the same number of filled positions that you have today. So if people were moved from MSI to City Justice Center, those people are still budgeted. Now, would there have to be, as I mentioned, within this budget, there are also funds appropriated for detention housing elsewhere. So would there have to be a transfer perhaps to cover any other costs other than personnel associated with keeping a unit open at MSI, yeah, it would probably be done that. But in terms of the total budget, regardless of whether it's 632 or 633 or one corrections unit or one corrections division, you should, I mean, the budgets side by side aren't that significantly different, such that you shouldn't be able to maintain a presence at MSI with the budget amount you have in hand.
Okay. All right. That's what I thought, but I just wanted clarity. Thank you. I'll keep listening because all the people prior to me kind of gave me some clarity. So I'll just keep listening. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. Alderman Muhammad, did you come back?
I did. Thank you,
All right,
Madam Chair.
sir. Go right ahead.
All of my questions have been asked, and so some of the answers that I heard, I understand, but I'm still a little confused on the whole ordeal. I want to go back to what my colleague, Alderwoman Howard, asked. How are we funding a building? So historically, MSI and CJC have had their own separate budgets. How are we actually funding a building with CJC funds, or as you said, the Division of Correction funds? How are we actually funding this? What is the amount? And I know you said there is not a cost savings, but is there an anticipated cost savings coming that we just don't know about? And I do have concerns about using the federal relief money to make up for the gap holes that we're going to experience because of the federal contract that was just abruptly ended. And I guess I want to know, what is your professional opinion, being a budget director for, I believe, 20 years or a little longer than that, which I don't see how you do it. Don't see how you do it. What is your professional opinion on this, on all of this, and how will this affect our budget going forward in the next 5 years or the next 10 years?
Well, a lot of questions there. Going back to the original one in terms of the budget for MSI and such. Currently, again, going back to FY21, the current year's budget of these two budgets, they were on a projection to underspend that budget. If it weren't for the repairs that we needed to transfer money into to do some of those CJC repairs, they would have underspent their overall budget this year. So if you think about that as your base and you look forward in FY22, regardless of whether it's 632 or 633, you are comparable, although there were some savings there, but it was more like a 1.7 million. You are comparable into what we were spending in the current fiscal year. So so again, whether those personnel are assigned to one point or the other, they've still been budgeted and all. Now you may have to move within the line items from funds because, for instance, we had the $1.4 million in detention that you may not need, and then you transfer that over to some facility maintenance costs or something like that. But overall, you're comparable. Now you did have the $1.7 million in savings, and those were funding the new initiatives. Over the long term, so in the short term, I don't think it's the funding. It's a funding issue, and we're not using. Just to correct one thing, we're not using federal relief monies to cover anything. That's a separate appropriation. That's not in this. That doesn't enter into this discussion. Okay. But so in the short term, I think we'd have to do what we do to ensure that we have the balanced budget at the end of the year. Over the longer term, however, it's the loss of revenue. Yeah, that anytime you lose a recurring source of revenue, that just makes your task harder in developing a structurally balanced budget, because you say, hey, you want to have revenues that balance off with your expenditures, and hopefully you don't have to do one-time things to make that balance happen. So you look for revenues that are recurring and you rely on each year. So yeah, that's a hit. That's a loss of about $7 million per year that was offsetting some of our correctional costs, and that's what it is. Now over the long term, perhaps as staff attrition's out and you reevaluate that, you could get additional savings from your corrections. That may occur. I think it's too early to tell based on what the trends are, but that's possible. But again, most of those costs that you're paying today are driven by personnel, so that takes time. But yeah, I think over the longer term, the loss of the revenue that is identifiable today, and that is a loss that will be carried forward going for in years to come. So that's something that would be just a greater challenge going forward.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Director. I appreciate your responses. And I'm just still a little lost. I'm trying to understand it. I'll tell you, this is the most difficult budget year that I've seen. I have not been here long, but I have served on Ways and Means since coming to the board. And this has been the most tedious process and the most daunting process. And just the lack of communication from the executive branch has been less than pleasing. So I know I know it's hard for you as well. And I appreciate everything you do and appreciate your expertise. I have no further questions, Madam Chair. And not because I don't want to ask, I just really don't understand how to even ask the questions I want to ask, because this process is so, I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Alderman, you are not alone. Okay. Thank you. Alderwoman Navarro.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Paul, for walking us through this and for your patience with our questions. And I think I've, followed this pretty well, but I do, like my colleagues, still trying to get all of this under control. So one question, let me know if I have this right. So it seems like I understand that there's an assumption that, by the time you get to the end of the year, there are certain departments that, have leftover funds essentially. And so we're kind of making an assumption that we're going to be okay at the end of this year because there are certain departments that won't have used all their money. And so that will still be sitting in the general revenue fund and we can pull that out when we need it. How do we reflect that on paper at this stage of the game? Is that coming, are we relying on, there's the funds in reserves essentially that can pad that if we need it?
No, basically, we look at the end of the year as we look at most of the expenditures are in hand. I mean, you've got the 25th pay, you've got one more payroll. So when the comptroller's office usually works with this, and I talk with them frequently as the end of the month approaches, saying, how are we looking on total expenditures? So you look at, you've got 25 pays in the books and there's only one payroll left. So that's a big chunk right there. And you can see how that plays out. And then you say, okay, are there any other large individual contractual items that we still need to pay? We obviously don't want to hit a department to where they have to carry over an expense. Let's say, one top of the head, like your refuse payment to the transfer station or something like that. You want to make sure all those bills are up to date and paid. And then after all that's done, what does it look like in terms of the room you have? Again, most of it is going to be in personnel. Now, a lot of that was complicated this year because there's charging back and forth with the CARES Act, which messes up. If you're familiar with projections, I'll go through and say, okay, it's this many pays, this many. Oh, but last week we did this charge off to CARES, and so it messes up your projections. So that's been a little frustrating this year, but it's actually a good thing because you have assistance. But from a projection standpoint, it does create a little bit of challenge. But looking at that, I do believe there is sufficient room for getting that done. Just preliminary looking at it. And so that's not going to be final until the end of the fiscal year, however. But I do believe we're probably in a good stead to be able to achieve that.
Okay, so you're saying essentially like our beginning balance going into FY22 is going to be healthy enough to cover this? Well,
no, what I was saying is the current year's budget, absorbing that 3.8, which we'd be moving over, is there sufficient room within the current year's budget to absorb that? And it looks as though there would be. So that solves your 11-16 problem for next year, because then you have a sufficient balance in that fund to cover that final year of appropriation. And again, after this, it goes away, but at least this year you'd be covered. This coming year.
Okay, I mean, I think I follow sufficiently. So the only, I guess this is maybe more of a comment, but just as we go throughout this next fiscal year, because the current budget eliminates a lot of positions that we haven't filled, but we've been allocating funding for those positions to other things. I mean, specifically, the police budget. And I think we're all, hopeful that, this next year there will be improvements and some, reimagining some of the ways we do policing, and some of these other social services will maybe reduce the need for as much police overtime. But I guess that's just something that we can look in the years past and say, okay, well, we've had kind of this leftover money for a variety of different reasons that you've suggested. But I'm just wondering if we are eliminating some of those opportunities for leftover money at the end of the year by eliminating so many positions. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Well, actually, that's basically going back to the police discussion. Yeah, I mean, basically, you're making a conscious decision to eliminate vacant positions, which means, so they had been spending overtime to compensate for the loss of positions. But that means they will have to spend less in overtime. And that's just something that's going to have to be monitored throughout the fiscal year to make sure that they stay within that appropriation limit. So that's just part of that budget, and we know going in.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for hanging with us as we work to understand all of this. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I have no more questions.
Okay, Alderwoman Middlebrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Budget Director Payne, for entertaining us this morning with all of our questions. I really don't have much of a question, more so a comment, because I'm absolutely lost with this. And it could be because I'm such a concrete thinker and assuming. I just cannot focus or find myself assuming how things will work out in the future. And as Alderwoman Boyd stated, it seems as if we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it's going to come back to bite us at some point. So it's just kind of very hard for me to wrap my head around a lot of things, but a lot of my questions have been answered somewhat. So thank you.
All right. Alderwoman Evans. Alderwoman Evans. Okay, let's, I just have a few comments for myself, and I do see that I have two hands up, and so I'll get back to you in just a second. I guess, and I made a couple of notes because you all have brought up some things that I had not thought about, because I was basically trying to say, in my thinking process, although dealing with budgets over the years, and my experience is extremely heavy, and even dealing with budgets much larger than this. So the problem that was created without the input of those who actually do the day-to-day and operations, and knowing what the requirements would be based on decisions that were made without their input. So now I'm going to add to this that as we move forward, we don't know what to expect. And even adding the question about the police overtime, because based on the rate of crime that we see every day, it's definitely overtime on every shift because of the number of people they have to chase down, arrest, do reports, all of that. It's not anywhere near normal. So we know we're going to, and it doesn't look like it's going to let up. So those assumptions cannot be made. The other part to that is we don't know what emergency might come up. Just like the emergencies that came up through this surprise after we were already working on our budget. We don't know what else might come up. And the fact that we have already released a large number of correctional officers, again, without including the appropriate direct input, we may even have a greater challenge before us in a very short period of time. Because we already know that within, I think, 2 or 3 days of closing the workhouse, we were over capacity in city jail. So we've got a lot to work with. And I want us to think and understand that you may not be able to fix this right now. And I want us to continue to ask questions. And I so appreciate you, Paul, because you have done a magic trick here, but I don't think it's going to be sustainable. And that's just my opinion. Based on what we've seen happen in the last 2 weeks, I don't think it's going to be sustainable. So we're going to move on. I'm going to go back to Alderman Boyd because you were not ready at that point. Are you ready now, sir?
I am. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Go right
Paul,
ahead.
you had talked about, unspent revenues, basically. But I think it's important to also highlight the fact that we end up with unspent revenues at the end of the year because around April, departments are told they can't spend anymore. Isn't that correct?
That would have been true for last year. That wasn't true this year. I think
Okay.
it was quite late. I think it was in late May or something. I don't know when that letter was sent out, but what you're referring to is whatever the cutoff is that the comptroller issues each year in terms of finishing the fiscal year. In years in which there are shortfalls, obviously last year with being with COVID and all, there was an early date. This year, I don't think that was the case.
Well, I was told by the secretary that we had to order some stuff by a certain date, probably a month ago. So maybe they're just used to telling.
That may be. I mean, it was late May. That might be.
Okay, so this year they have been told, as they have in the past, that they cannot spend anymore after a certain date.
Yeah, because you got to close out the budget.
And I want to say it again, my biggest concern, and I think someone else mentioned it, is the police overtime. Because what I project is going to happen is that you're going to monitor it, and then you're going to tell departments, especially when it gets to March and April, you can't spend anymore. So you can make up that deficit with police overtime, which is really unfair to those departments, because why allocate $1 million to a department just to get to March or April and say, well, you can't spend this other $300,000 that they really needed. I mean, I don't think that's fair, or it's just putting together a disingenuous budget, which, I'm of the opinion that not having an appropriate amount of money in overtime is disingenuous. And this is not on you, Paul, because you had to, play the hand that you were given. And you're the budget director. You don't run E&A. But I wouldn't want to have your job because it's frustrating. I can imagine you probably take Tums every night. But you do an awesome job and you're greatly appreciated. You're always, pulling a rabbit out the hat. I do understand the physical, financial gymnastics that you're going to, work toward as far as balancing the budget. But this is probably the most screwed up budget that we've ever been presented, that I have ever been presented with at the Board of Aldermen. And it's really too bad. And I'm just hoping that when it passes, however it passes, that the constituents, do not lose out on city services, for the sake of some trendy things happening across the country. So again, thank you, Paul, for what you do. And Madam Chair, you're back.
Thank you. I need to go back to a couple of committee members, and then I see that we have another alderperson that wants to ask a question. So Alderman Vaccaro.
I just want to, so here's what sort of is aggravating me. So we got $3 million left over. Yet this year, we told the constituents, you get no streets, you get no alleys, you get no trees, you get no ward capital. You didn't put ward capital in the budget this last year. The only way we got any ward capital was because Jeffrey Boyd fought with the treasurer's office and was able to get 5 million, which wasn't even the appropriate amount by ordinance. It should have went to all the wards. So all the aldermen get all this, people that are upset, why didn't my sidewalks, why aren't my trees, why aren't this getting done? Yet we were told it's on the backs of the people. I'm really frustrated. We're going into a budget that has taken away the police, which they were using part of that and still did overtime. I anticipate overtime this year to be upwards of probably $15 or $20 million, which is going to come out of the reserves. I anticipate this whole jail disaster is going to cost money. I'm just putting it out there. I think at the end of this fiscal year, we are probably going to take, in order to survive this budget, we're probably going to lose somewhere between 10 and $20 million of our reserves. We only got 40 million, which is going to affect our credit rating, which is going to hurt us in the long run. Paul, tell me, the police traditionally have spent the money that they haven't had for police officers, right? Plus have gone about 10 million in overtime, right? Is it that we're going to say if somebody's murdered laying on the street, we might have to leave them laying there for a few days to avoid overtime? I know that's crazy and that's not going to happen, but it is going to come off the backs of the people in my neighborhood because we do not have traffic enforcement. Not only just my neighborhood, throughout the city. We're going to balance this budget off the backs of the taxpayers that we'll control overtime. We just won't let police. And I know this is not you, Paul. I'm just making a statement. But we're telling people in my neighborhood, you can't have traffic enforcement. Our ward capital is the lowest I've ever seen it, except for last year when we had none. You know, this whole stuff just aggravates me. I know it's not you, but again, last year you were sitting there telling us there's no savings in closing the jail. And apparently you're right, there is none. And then I sit here and you're saying, well, we're going to kind of watch how we do the police overtime. Here's the whole thing. Well, if we pass this doing this kind of crazy stuff, here's what's going to happen. When things don't work out, they're going to go, well, these guys voted on it. It always comes back to us. You know what? In my opinion, E&A is the one that thought this was a great budget. I think it's their problem. And certainly, you know, if we pass this mess, everything's it's going to fall apart. We're going to be well into reserves to cover this budget, whether we pretend to make it balanced or not, because police overtime is going to be there. Eliminating those positions, it's just going to make overtime go higher, not lower. We're not going to control it. And yeah, we can control it. We just eliminate police on the streets. We'll just have the police all work on murders only. But in my neighborhood, we don't see police. And you know, I'm putting speed humps everywhere. I've done literally everything I could think of doing, although I don't even have the ward capital for speed humps. And then they keep changing the rules on how that happens. And again, I know this is not your fault, Paul, but I just want to take this opportunity to moan and complain that Last year's budget did not include ward capital, except it was 0. And now we're saying, well, we got about $3 million left over. Yet there was ordinances and that people voted on that the percent of the sales tax, the 1%, should have been put into ward capital. Yet we said to the people of the city, you know what, screw you, you're not going to get it. So to sit here and say, well, you know what, they knew, somebody knew that the intention was to close that jail. Somebody knew that we were going to lose that federal money. To sit there and say, well, when we sent it over, we didn't anticipate that. And there is a cost associated with keeping that facility open. I don't care how we say it or we don't say it. I'm sure we have the lights on, the air conditioning on, the electric. There's got to be somebody in that building maintaining it. There's got to be, if all the guards are over at the other building, so what are we going to do when we send the prisoners back over there? We're going to have to send guards back. And then the guards are told, I saw this on the news the other day, there's no money in the budget for stabbing protection that the county and everywhere else has. So that if somebody gets out of their cell and they have a shank or whatever you want to call it, we can't afford to give our people working at jail the proper equipment to protect themselves. Yet in the county and everywhere else, they have it. And I mean, I saw it on the news the other night, and the mayor's office said, it's not going to happen this year. We don't have the money. You know what? I'm moaning and upset because this is just flat. I'm trying not to use bad words.
Don't use bad words.
And I'm trying not to. But this is beyond anything normal. We cannot protect the people in the jail. We're going to overcrowd it. I think personally, somebody's going to get hurt or killed and the city's going to get sued. And we're going to have even a bigger thing because we're knowingly not providing them with the equipment, telling them we don't have the money in the budget. Paul, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Would you think the overtime is probably going to be in the 15 to $20 million, or you can give me the political answer when we don't know until we get there? But based off of all the past years, and without the money even for them extra officers, the overtime is going to be crazy. And I guess we can take it away from ward capital. So you didn't spend it yet. They did that to us quite a few years back. They said, well, we took the money that you had put into projects and we took it away. They went in and wiped out all of our ward capital, saying, well, we're going to use that. We had to use it to balance. So we're going to sit there partway through the year as we get into police and fire overtime? Or are we just going to, are they going to take our projects away from us again? Are they going to use to balance? Or are we going to just go into the reserves and cut the reserves in half? Because we said we got to protect those. That's why we didn't let us have ward capital. I'm just upset. I mean, we're doing this off the backs of the people, and the budget is a sham. I can tell you at the end of this budget, and Paul, you're a smarter guy than me. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're going to be digging deep into the reserves, or we're going to misuse the funds and claim everything's COVID related. The streets didn't get done because of COVID or something. We're going to come up with some, put ourselves even a bigger risk. But I agree with the president of the board. This budget it's a mess, and I don't feel that I want this hung on me. I can't support this budget because, again, it just reminds me of other things. They said, well, you voted on it anyway. You voted on it. Well, I can't vote on this mess. But Paul, and Paul, I appreciate you. I know you work hard and everybody knows that. But this is just crazy. I mean, we can't. Anyway, I'm just going to ramble in. I'm going to let it go. But Paul, I guess the question I would ask, do you really believe that we're not going to have police overtime? Even more this year than in past years? Just your
Well,
guess.
well, heck, I presented what the historical numbers are, and so that's no mystery in terms of what they have done traditionally. But looking forward, going forward this year, obviously there's going to have to be some operational changes such that they can't spend it. I mean, that was the directions that were given and presented when those changes were made in the budget. So I can't get into the, and I'm not the operations guy, so I can't get into the discussion about how that is to be achieved, but that is plainly the goal. And just globally, I was going to say, just from a budget standpoint, budgets are basically plans. You're taking a looking at what you anticipate both receiving in revenues and expenditures when you start the fiscal year. And as events transpire, you have to be able to adapt to what happens. I remember going through this last year, and last year's budget was an incredible case study. And how do you deal with what all these unknowns? I mean, the economy was shut down. How do you project revenues based on that? And what are you going to be responsible? What kind of costs associated with COVID were you going to anticipate? Now, I think we've been fortunate in a number of ways. One is that, as I mentioned, revenues are not as far down as we've anticipated, but also we've got a significant amount of federal assistance over the last year that help us through this. So financially, I'm not as pessimistic as you may be in terms of revenues and where we end up in that regard. I am, however, and I will continue to hit this point, in terms of the longer term outlook of things. And so that when all of this settles down and COVID's in the rearview mirror and we've got a good plan for spending the federal assistance and all, when we come out at 5 years from now or so, are we positioned to where we have a structurally balanced budget and positioned to where we can grow revenues to meet expenditures so that we can maintain all those services that you find important. So that's the kind of thinking that I'm when I look at it, it's not so much the shorter term as the longer game. And that's sort of what I'd like to be able to focus
on. Paul, thank you. I just wanted my concerns out there, and I'm going to guess that at the end of the year I'll be right. And I'm just guessing. Same way we can only guess, but I'm guessing I won't be wrong, because we're going to have to provide police services. There's no magic way to work around it. Crime is up. Over the weekend, we have 20 or I think over 20 people shot.
Yes.
And 3 or 4 dead, 3 in one incident. We're already well ahead of last year. I mean, you can't sit there and say, well, oh, my shift's up. I'll just have to leave this guy laying on the street till the next shift comes on. When one detective gets that scene, they're there until ever. And then they have to go out and talk to witnesses, and you have to show up at court. I just know that, I mean, again, we're putting people and the city at great risk by telling the corrections officers, we don't have the equipment we don't have the money for the equipment to protect you. And that was on the news last night before last. These guys are saying, hey, we just want simple equipment to protect ourselves. And the city said, not this year. I really think the city, when somebody gets hurt or killed, that the city's going to have a much bigger lawsuit that we're going to have to deal with because we did not provide the proper equipment to protect our employees. This is Anyway, I'm gonna let it go because, Paul, this isn't really a budget thing. This isn't really against you. This is me at least wanting it out there, you know, that this is how I feel. Doesn't reflect you, doesn't reflect on the budget. It reflects my opinion of what's going to happen, and I just wanted that out there. That's all. But Paul, thank you, and I know you're trying your best to get this somehow figured out. But I do appreciate that. I just, when this comes to the end of the year and this whole thing falls apart and we're going into reserves just to keep things paid for, and we're shifting the money from the workhouse into the general fund, which we would have the money eventually, but we may have to use the reserves to get to that. And we may have to use the reserves to get the police overtime. I predict that we're going to beat the reserves up pretty good. And anyway, but thank you all. I'm going to mute myself, and I promise not to raise my hand again, at least during this part.
All right, thank you, sir. I wanted to share with Alderwoman Rice, Alderman Gunther, Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. I only have one more committee person, and then if you all want to ask some questions, I'll be getting to you momentarily. Alderwoman Carol Howard.
I just wanted to say thank you, Paul. I am very, very much concerned about creating this ongoing deficit and then trying to fill the gap with funds that are temporary funds coming from the federal government. I think this is a miscarriage of our fiduciary duties here. I also, as the alderman from the 23rd expressed, I'm also concerned very much about the public safety issue. People are paying their taxes. I represent taxpayers here in the city of St. Louis, and the outrage that I am hearing about, money going to help people that, and I'm not saying that we don't need to help and be charitable towards people, but I think people feel like the scales are tipped in the wrong direction and that their taxpayer dollars are not being used judiciously and in a fair way. So, and I know, Paul, you've worked hard. I appreciate your time and all the detail you've provided us. I hope that we can come to some understanding and way to allay the angst in our communities here over public safety and the idea of, we're closing the workhouse, but what is that what impact is that going to have on us long term and budgetarily? So thank you again, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I appreciate everything you do. Thank you.
Okay. Alderwoman Evans, I saw you just came back. Alderwoman Evans? Okay, I can't.
She's muted.
Alderwoman Evans, are you still muted? Would you like to ask any questions? She didn't get. Okay, Alderwoman Rice.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to ask a question. I did just have one follow-up. Paul, could you speak to sort of the historical trend of the federal detainees and the money that we're getting for those detainees? If I remember correctly, it wasn't always that high of a number that we were getting in compensation for those detainees. Is that right?
Yeah, in this most recent few years, going back to FY19, that was under a new agreement, a relatively new agreement, where they reimbursed us at around $90 per day, and that was a significant amount of revenue. Going back historically, yeah, it's been a number. It wasn't very significant. It was maybe $1 million a year or something like that. But that was a completely different agreement. I'm trying to remember how long ago that was, prior to this more recent iteration. I don't know if I have a history here or not. Let's see. Yeah, it was somewhere like if you go back to like FY 10, 11.
60 something.
Yeah, we used to get maybe $1 million a year, and that was all in general revenue.
Okay.
But that was a different agreement, right?
Right. Well, I guess that's helpful for understanding. We also had a much higher detainee number in general when that was the case. So the historic trend of the number of detainees that we have held within St. Louis City jails has been on the downward trend now, but it sounds like that the federal detainee reimbursement had increased over these last couple of years. So we kind of had a corresponding dip and then dip in number of detainees, but then increase in what we were being reimbursed from the feds for the federal detainees.
Yeah, I don't know those numbers, but yeah, my understanding is that the most recent agreement was obviously more favorable in terms of recovering costs than the earlier.
Right. Well, and it surely, I mean, we would love to be getting the right amount of money from the state to be holding folks on state charges. That's it's a lot for the state to be asking a municipality to be detaining folks without proper reimbursement for those costs. So I guess I just wanted to ask that to highlight that this hasn't. So when we're talking about a historic or a legacy deficit, this is not a sort of a legacy revenue line either, right? If we're looking, it's not something that we have always counted on as a city that we have always worked with. So it does create a dip now as those detainees have been moved out of our jails, but I guess I just want to highlight that it's not a static, right? It's not the type of revenue line that has been in place for 20 years that, it's not like a tax revenue fund that we count on all the time. So do you feel like that's fair to say?
Well, yeah. Let me put it this way. I do remember when there was discussions when the Justice Center was built. There was a lot of discussion about where it should be built. What's the best location? You expand MSI and build a new facility there, or do you bring it downtown or all downtown? I remember one of the benefits of the current location of the Justice Center was that it was right across the street from the federal courthouse, and that gave us the opportunity to have that kind of relationship with the federal marshals. I do remember that being a consideration. So over the long term. Now, again, as I mentioned, going back 10 years, it wasn't significant revenue. It was more FY19 forward that new arrangement was had such that it became more significant.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Just a little bit of historic context on that. Yeah, I guess the other question I would have, Madam Chairwoman, is the committee planning on taking a vote on Board Bill 1 this week, or are we having these discussions for the public transparency and for the benefit of the knowledge of the members?
So we are having I was trying to make sure every committee person had the right understanding so they're prepared.
Great.
When that question is asked of them.
Okay.
And I've already requested that the sponsor appear tomorrow, and we will make that decision as a committee as a whole.
Okay, great. Thank you. That helps clear it up. I was just curious. I know we've all been following along from the outside here, so I appreciate that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask questions, Madam Chair.
Okay. Alderman Gunther.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mostly was here and I've been at most of these Ways and Means Committee hearings just to get a better understanding of how our budget process is working. But I guess from what I've kind of taken in, not only from this hearing, but just kind of the hearings over the last few weeks here, last month or so. So I guess Director Payne, so just to clarify this, so we had a budget that was proposed to us, Board Bill 1. We're in the middle of this budget process. We had this $5.7 million reduction because of the federal government being, taking their detainees out. But overall, we have what, a $1.15 billion budget, something like that, correct?
Yeah.
Close. So from last week's Ways and Means, I recall that the sponsor of the bill said he couldn't take it up because we had this hole. It goes against state charter, our state statute. So we weren't going to move on it until the ENA, the mayor's office, came up with how to balance that $5.7 million hole. And so, Director Payne, this is essentially what your presentation was today, right? This is how we're balancing that 5.7.
Actually, it is not. What it was doing, the initial question last week, and they were debating last week, is that if you go through the traditional amendment process, what sources can we grab and reallocate in order to address the issue? Well, that didn't result in a vote one way or the other or any sort of outcome. So given that set of circumstances, what else can we do? And so what I talked about today was, if you have no amendments and there's nothing goes on that, how can we fix that? How can we fix that special fund from going deficit? And that's what I talked about today in terms of the charges being allocated to general revenue and such that that fund does not go deficit for next fiscal.
Gotcha. So you're identifying the solution to not go into deficit.
Right.
Okay. So then, as a person following this along and not being on the committee, it would appear to me that you've identified how we're going to present a budget. So I guess the question, if tomorrow the bill sponsor comes, would he essentially just be submitting Board Bill 1 committee substitute with those changes that we would then be able to pass out a balanced budget?
That particular solution I was discussing didn't require an amendment. I mean,
okay.
Basically it's changing something we're doing in the current fiscal year with the current appropriation such that it would result in that budget not being changed.
All right. Yeah, I think that was the clarity I was looking for about what our sessions here are truly discussing. So that was kind of my main concern. That was what I was trying to figure out. And so I thank you for clarifying how exactly we're addressing the shortfall so that we could have a budget that we can pass out of committee and out of the board, which would help us to, like we've been talking about, help us to get services to our communities immediately and not hold things up. So thank you very much for these presentations. They have been very insightful. And Chairwoman Davis, I thank you very much for the opportunity to ask that question.
All right, sir. Alderwoman Clark Hubbard. Did she leave?
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm on double duty. No questions at this time.
All right, that's okay. Well, I saw, Alderwoman Ingracia.
I don't have any questions, Madam Chair. Thank you for asking.
Okay. I think that's it for, I think that's it. Alderwoman Evans, can you unmute yourself? Because you still haven't had an opportunity to speak. I don't know, she must be having some technical difficulties. Alderwoman Howard, did you put your hand up again?
No, Madam Chair, I just forgot to take it down.
Okay, thank you. So we've all had an opportunity to speak. I just wanted to add a couple of things very quickly. the normal process, and it's a shame for new members on this committee and or on the Board of Aldermen. This is their first experience because this is not how it normally works. But have we not accidentally found out about those things that had changed after we received our budget and we were well into working on our budget, almost 3 weeks in, it would have been a total disaster. And this is also unfortunate. So where we are today, because we don't have, we want to make sure that whatever takes place, it takes place by June 30th. And that is a short period of time that even if we, no matter what we decided to do, and I'm leaving it up to the sponsor of the bill on how he wants to move forward. We will have the opportunity to operate with a budget presence, and the city will move forward, and no one's going to miss any services or anything. And so we will wait to determine that tomorrow. But I think we've had a lot of things cleared up, although we are still confused. And I'll admit that as well. It is just quite remarkable. And that's all I can say. I mean, I've even worked on budgets, just my independent budget in the census process, just for my personnel department. And I was responsible for hiring 6,000 people and opening up 32 offices in Eastern Missouri. And we never ended up with a problem like this. Nevertheless, the other 7 budgets involved with that. And we all worked together and communicated well. So I'm not sure where we're going forward, but I hope there's more communication, and I hope there's more professionalism added into decisions that need to be made from those who actually do the day-to-day. And I would like to say to my committee, I do appreciate you. I think that you all have all been very diligent on being present, asking the right questions. And tomorrow is another day that we're going to have to just dig in, and it might get a little ugly. I don't know, but I'm leaving it up to the bill sponsor, okay? And I'm going to ask that question. If anybody thinks that that is the wrong direction for me to take, open up your mic and say it.
No, I agree 100% with you. It's going to be the sponsor, and I plan to support the sponsor. I won't, even if the sponsor says we're going to move forward, I don't personally think I can support it. But whatever he wants to do, it's up to him. I'll make my own decision tomorrow.
All right, sir. Anybody else have any comments on that?
I agree. Just for clarity, we meet tomorrow at 1, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Anyone else? And you don't have to necessarily make a statement. But I just want to make sure if anybody needed to, that it was available to them. Okay, hearing none, let's finish our agenda here. And we don't have any resolutions before us. Is there any other discussion that you need to have as a committee member? And again, just open your mic if it's something that you need to share. Hearing none, we'll move forward. I do need to excuse Alderman Oldenburg. All other members were present. I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll make that motion. I'll second that.
It's been moved and second. We are all those in favor say aye.
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 Hearing nobody say no, no one's opposed.